Dan Lanning's new contract makes him a top 5 paid head coach in the sport. Does his salary meet his overall status within college football? Now, there's going to be some changes in Bloomington, Indiana, in Hoosier land this upcoming season in 2025. One thing that I think won't change, their great offensive production.
From LA to Piscataway, all Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
I think this time of year, the right here and the right now, this is when the 2025 season really begins. This is the official launching point towards late August and early September of 2025. The recruiting dead period is over, so some of those battles, big spring visits, unofficials, official visits later on in the June time period, certainly as well. And then we've got spring practice really heating up. I think Purdue is already on the field. Barry Odom, in his first year of the Boilermakers, they're trying to get a head start. They're trying to get as much practice time, certainly, as they can. Get a head start on some folks to try to rebuild that thing in West Lafayette. We're going to have some great spring football coverage here on the show and the YouTube channel and the podcast feeds certainly coming up. So it's an exciting time of year. Everybody's going 12-0. There's a lot of optimism, but there's also a lot of things certainly floating in the air with a lot of these Big Ten teams. One thing that's not floating in the air, the certainty, the confidence, the excitement at the head coach position at the University of Oregon. Dan Lanning has signed a new deal at the University of Oregon. A new 6-year contract averaging around $11 million per season. He's getting about a $2 million pay bump per season. And it's a top 5 salary nationally in the sport of college football. The buyout, $20 million for Dan Lanning. It could be $30 million. It could be $40 million, $50. It could be $100 million because Oregon and Dan Lanning continue to show the ultimate investment in each other right now. I think it really started from Dan's point of view when the grass was damn green in Eugene. Oregon, I will stay here as long as you'll have me, right? That 1-minute viral clip when his name was getting floated around for the Alabama job after Nick Saban retired. That was him putting his feet into the wet concrete and saying, I'm here to stay. I'm here to build something. I'm here to build and bring a championship team to the University of Oregon. That was his investment. I think that was his commitment. Because when you've looked at Oregon in the past, there has been a little bit of this stepping stone mantra. Of course, Chip Kelly going up to the National Football League, Mario Cristobal going to Miami, Willie Taggart going to Florida State. Like Duck fans, you already know the story. You already know the story. And I think Dan Lanning putting his feet, like I said, into the wet concrete and letting that concrete dry around him so he stays at the University of Oregon. That was his commitment. And I think this new contract was Rob Mullins, the athletic director, the athletic administration at Oregon saying, we believe that you are one of the best coaches in all of college football. We believe in everything that you are doing, and this is rightfully deserved. You are one of the best coaches in college football, and I just so happen to agree with the athletic administration at Oregon by having that sentiment, by throwing this contract out at Dan Lanning, and of course, both parties signing up on the dotted line as well. Oregon knows exactly how good they have it right now. Oregon knows exactly the gem that Dan Lanning is right now. And the investment that was made with Dan, not even entertaining the Alabama stuff, not even entertaining when like the big money Texas A&M job, right, might have come and open, not even entertaining that stuff. Oregon, Dan Lanning has said many times he has shown appreciation for the University of Oregon taking a chance on him. And now the University of Oregon is returning this favor with this huge contract saying, this is us returning the favor of the investment that you have made in Duck football and the success and the rungs up the ladder that you have taken football up here in Oregon out on the West Coast. I do not foresee Dan Lanning leaving for another college head coaching job. Dan Lanning has everything he needs to be successful, to win championships at Oregon. He has all of the resources. He has all the facilities. He has all the financial backing. He has everything he needs in Eugene. There are few other places, I think, right now that would be a truly better situation than the Oregon Ducks right now for Dan Lanning. They have really aligned themselves to building a championship level culture and building a championship level team. The only thing that's missing is the 1 in the column instead of the 0 right now. And I think Dan Lanning's going to get them there. And I think Dan Lanning is ultra motivated to get them to that point. Dan Lanning is a very loyal guy. And I think he is going to be loyal to Oregon to get them that first, maybe second, maybe who knows how many national championships he's going to be able to bring to Oregon when all is said and done. Now, he said in the past, he says, hey, yeah, I've had a goal of coaching in the National Football League before, but right now my feet are planted at Oregon. I think eventually, it could be 5 years down the road, it could be 10 years, it could be 15 years. Down the road. Dan Lanning is young enough right now at 38 years old that he could coach for another 10 years at Oregon, and then he could pursue a career in the National Football League. I think eventually that itch is going to be scratched for Dan Lanning. I don't know when it's going to happen. A lot of people, I think, have said, hey, Dan Lanning, maybe reminiscent of another Dan in the NFL with Dan Campbell, of course, the head coach of the Detroit Lions. His aggressiveness and really his mentality and his attitude, I think, are pretty similar to what Dan Campbell is doing with the Detroit Lions, certainly right now. Now, when you look at his salary, being a top 5 salary in the sport of college football, is he a top 5 head coach in college football? I kind of took a minute to kind of think of the coaches in the Big Ten, think of the coaches in the SEC, the ACC, and some of these bigger conferences and bigger programs out there. And I kind of started going down the list, and I started checking off names, and I kind of approached it this way. Would I rather have that coach, or would I rather have Dan Lanning in charge of my football program right now? When I looked at it from the Big Ten level, I think outside of Ryan Day, I think he's the top head coach right now in the Big Ten. Outside of Ryan Day, I don't think there's any coach that I would rather have leading my program right now than Dan Lanning. I think James Franklin could possibly be in the mix, but right now, I love the young tenacity, the recruiting. We'll get to the relationship building here in just a minute, which is a huge skill for Dan, but I might have nobody other than Ryan Day I'd rather have leading my program right now than Dan Lanning. And there might be some school of thought out there that says, hey, maybe Dan Lanning might be number 1 on that list in the Big Ten. When you go to the SEC, outside of like the Kirby Smarts, Steve Sarkisians, like, I look at some of the rest of those head coaches in the SEC. I look at the Lane Kiffins, the Brian Kellys, the Josh Heupels, the Mike Elkos. Give me Dan Lanning over all those guys. Give me Dan Lanning, Shane Beamers. Give me Dan Lanning above every single one of those guys right now. So he is a top 5 head coach paid in the sport. I mentioned Kirby Smart, Steve Sarkisian, the new Ryan Day contract. Dabo Swinney is also in there as well. I think Dan Lanning is really approaching that level. What he's been able to do Oregon, he already had a really good situation when he became the head coach at Oregon. But I don't think there's any doubt when it comes to an on-the-field perspective, a development perspective. Oregon just sent a record number of Ducks to the NFL Scouting Combine. Recruiting perspective, top 5 class. They're on pace for their 3rd consecutive top 5 class at the University of Oregon. I think when you bring it all together, I think Dan Lanning truly is. If you don't want to say he's top 5, okay, okay, maybe I'll give that to you. Certainly a guy like a Brian Kelly has a better resume than Dan right now. I think there's no question Dan Lanning is a top 10 coach in the sport. I'd feel pretty confident calling him like a top 7 head coach in the sport of college football. If he can continue to build upon that success, that's going to really cement him as one of the very best head coaches in college football right now. What makes Dan Lanning so great? All right, you got this guy. He's won a bunch of football games. They've taken steps up, bringing in better talent to Oregon, elite level talent to Oregon right now. But why is this happening? What is Dan Lanning's best skill set? I'm not breaking any news by saying this right now. Other people on bigger platforms have said this. But one thing that I've heard from a lot of Oregon people, this thing that I've heard from some national people as well, nobody, I repeat, nobody builds better relationships than Dan Lanning. No head coach is more involved talking to families, talking to recruits, even transfers. Like, you look at Dan Lanning's transfer portal success. I think the only guy that's come onto campus for a transfer visit at Oregon, and maybe there's lesser high-profile transfers that I'm missing here. Please leave them in the comments below if I am. But really the only significant transfer that has stepped on campus for a visit at Oregon and hasn't committed has been Walter Nolan, defensive tackle who went to Ole Miss. I think that was last year's cycle. Like, that should say something of the immediate impact, the immediate relationship that he can develop with somebody. And then it's his ability. I think this is also an underrated ability of Dan Lanning. The ability for him to have this Rolodex that he's formed throughout his coaching career, really rising up from the complete bottom now to pretty darn close to the complete top right now. But having this Rolodex of people that he's met along the way, people that have really impressed him. He's been really good at finding these younger coaches and really getting the most out of them. Like, you throw out a guy like Kenny Dillingham, really good success at Arizona State as a head coach so far. Now, he was offensive coordinator at other spots along the road, but of course his 1 year as the offensive coordinator at Oregon translated into that job to become the head coach at Arizona State. And now look what he's doing over there. But then you look, I mean, that's just a 1 year example, right? That's almost like a transfer portal example when it comes to the coaching ranks. But you look at guys that are maybe more of a recruits in the coaching ranks. Brian Michalowski was an analyst. He got upgraded to the inside linebackers coach last year. You have Bryce Better and Devin Jackson really take a big step up and have some big development over there. How about Alik Terry on the offensive line? What they're doing, back-to-back Joe Moore Award winners. Mike Cavanaugh, a big part of that, certainly. But then when you look at what Alik is doing on the recruiting trail as well, that really tells you kind of these diamonds in the rough that he can be able to get. You go out, they just hired a guy, Ross Douglas, the wide receivers coach and passing game coordinator. That's really young that I think could be really good in here as well. Like, his staffs that he's been able to build, surrounding himself with really good, like-minded people, is something that maybe goes a little bit overlooked when it comes to Dan Lanning. No question, Dan is one of the top head coaches in the sport. Lanning and Oregon, folks, they're here to stay. We go from one of the very best head coaches in all of college football to the team and the program that is led by the reigning, defending, undisputed National Coach of the Year, Curt Cignetti, and the Indiana Hoosiers. There's a lot of narratives floating around about this upcoming season in Bloomington, Indiana. We know what Indiana was able to do last year. We kind of know essentially the talking points around them from a year ago as it pertains to their schedule. And they do have a more difficult schedule certainly coming up this season with teams like Oregon, and I believe Penn State is on their schedule as well this season. But when I look forward to this 2025 Indiana team, I still think that this is going to be a high-level football team. Curt Cignetti is going to have a lot of people asking him, hey, was 2024 a flash in the pan? Was 2024 a one-year wonder? Can you repeat it? Can you run it back now that everybody knows kind of what you are about in Bloomington, Indiana? I don't know if they're going to go 11-1. If I had to bet my money right now, I would say yeah, they're not going to go 11-1 next season. But although some things may be changing around Bloomington, I still think this is going to be a great offense. I still think that this is going to be one of the Big Ten's best offenses, despite losing Tino Sincere. He was the co-OC and quarterbacks coach, really big part of Curt Cignetti's system. He was with them over at James Madison and also this past season at Indiana. He's going over to be the offensive coordinator over at UCLA. But you still bring back Mike Shanahan, the play caller, the offensive coordinator, joining with Curt Cignetti, obviously, for a second year in Bloomington. What made Indiana really good from an offensive perspective last year? What made them great from an offensive perspective? It all started with the signal caller. And the signal caller, the quarterback, really played into the mantra of Curt Cignetti and his approach to talent acquisition. Production over potential. Curtis Rourke, coming out of the MAC, put up some big numbers. He was coming off of an injury, and I think his experience, his poise, his knowledge, his cerebralness, not sure if that's a word, but his IQ, I think, of the game of football really led to the offensive success of the machine that they became on offense last year in Bloomington. You look forward to this year. I think there is a quarterback coming in, the number 3 quarterback in the transfer portal. There's a quarterback coming into Bloomington, Indiana that I believe is starting with a little bit of a higher floor than Curtis Rourke did. And I believe Fernando Mendoza could even have a higher ceiling at quarterback than Curtis Rourke was. Now remember, Fernando Mendoza, 2 years played over at Cal. He was one of 9 Golden Bear quarterbacks to have a 3,000-yard season, which that's what he threw for last year. And then when I watched Fernando Mendoza on tape, and he's a calm, cool customer. The pressure doesn't really get to him. He's really good at using his feet to really shift the pocket, whether it's stepping up into the pocket, whether it's getting to the outside, and really working on his secondary routes down the field. I think he's going to fit really, really well into this Indiana offense. I think when you really start to rank and start to look at Big Ten quarterbacks for next season, he's definitely like top 8. He might be close to number 5, considering the offensive system, considering the scheme and how quarterback-friendly it has been at James Madison, how quarterback-friendly it was in year 1 for Curtis Rourke over at Indiana. I think Fernando Mendoza, could put up a really big year for the Hoosiers this upcoming year. When I talk about Indiana's offense being great in 2025 like it was in 2024, a big reason is because of the aforementioned Fernando Mendoza. Now, Fernando Mendoza, I believe, is going to have success because he might have one of the best returning wide receiver duos in the Big Ten at his disposal. Elijah Sarratt was nearly a 1,000-yard receiver last year in his first season in the Big Ten. He's going to be returning. You also got Omar Cooper that is also going to be returning. That's a really good 1-2 tandem. Those were 2 of the big weapons in Indiana's offense last season. Both of those guys combined for 1,551 yards and 16 touchdowns. That's a lot of production. That's a lot of familiarness within the scheme. Guys knowing exactly where they have to be in certain route concepts. How is that relationship going to be built between Mendoza and these 2 guys? You know, spring football coming up is going to be a big part of that. And then you bring in Mekhi Jackson, who transfers over from Appalachian State. Production over potential. I'm going to keep on saying this. It's going to be a broken record when I talk about Indiana football. 745 yards and 5 touchdowns at Appalachian State. Tyler Morris comes over from Michigan. You can really start to see they're building similar at the wide receiver position. They're building something similar to what they were last season. Miles Cross, Miles Price, Keyshawn Williams, a really deep wide receiver room. And I talked about this all season when I talked about the Hoosiers. It's just you don't know where to defend sometimes in certain situations. When you overload the formation with so many guys that can make plays, it really puts a lot of stress on the defense. And now you have a quarterback that's experienced, that can get the football there, and a second year in a scheme, second year in a system. At this place, I know Elijah Sarratt was with those guys over at James Madison certainly as well. And I think that really plays into my point that I'm trying to make here is that a lot of times in year 2, you see a bigger jump than what you saw in year 1. And I feel really confident about what this passing game could certainly be in 2025. Now, the weakness, the losses, what was a big part and a big reason why the Ohio State game ended up the way it did and the Notre Dame game ended up the way it did? The offensive line. 3 starters return from that Indiana offensive line from last season. Now, there's a lot of things being thrown around right now out there about certain teams that say, hey, we got this many starters back. We've got this percentage of production returning. Sometimes that can be a really good thing. Sometimes it can be, well, how good was your production last season? If your production wasn't that great, how great is it that those guys are returning? But I will say this about the offensive line. I think that this offensive line is going to get better this season with those 3 starters returning. And I think a very big key going into the transfer portal and grabbing the number 1 offensive lineman in the transfer portal in Pat Coogan. Pat Coogan is an utter menace. He's a bully in there at center. I think that's a big addition for this offensive line. They bring in Zen Mikulski from Ohio State. Coming on over there. If you remember that Ohio State-Nebraska game, Mikulski, when they were playing those musical chairs, when they had those injuries, he was in at tackle. Didn't exactly do a great job in that Nebraska game, but he is a former 4-star recruit. I think that this Indiana offensive line, with the addition of Coogan, I think that's really going to help with their interior run game, certainly as well. I think that's a big addition, and I think they're going to get progressively better as the year goes on, which of course is which is good news, music to the ears of quarterback Fernando Mendoza. I want to end with the run game. Now, when we talk about that type of production that is returning at wide receiver, you got to talk about the production that is leaving at the running back position. Justice Ellison and Tyson Lawton combined for 1,516 yards and 22 touchdowns on the ground. A lot of people wanted to focus on the sexiness that was Curtis Rourke and Indiana and their passing game pushing the ball down the field. But this was one of the best run games in the Big Ten last season. But once again, this is a production. They focus on the production when they look at these transfers, and they're bringing in 2 transfer running backs to create a lot more depth in the backfield that have done it before, that have put up really good seasons and been number 1 backs elsewhere. Lee Beebe Jr. transfers from UAB, 877 yards and 7 touchdowns last season. For you Big Ten fans that have been watching this show for a little bit, you know this name, Roman Hemby from Maryland. Now, he's rushed for at least 600 yards in every single one of his seasons as a running back. You got to go back to his freshman year to have his best year in 2022, 989 yards and 10 touchdowns on the ground. That was, and one thing I remember about that season was his ability to hit the home run ball. Once he found his crease, he could take it 40, 50, 60 yards to the house. I think having those 2 in this system, and then you combine it, Kalen Black is coming back within this running back room as well. I think there's going to be good depth in the running back room. I think the big question is, are they going to be as good as Justice Ellison? Are they going to be as good as Tyson Lawton was last year? I think a returning offensive line, having Coogan up front to really help with that interior blocking in the interior run game is certainly going to help as well. You really go down at each one of these position groups, and Indiana is looking that they could be another offensive force in 2025. Spring football is fast approaching, folks. Going to be breaking down some storylines, some pre-spring power rankings. I know everybody gets revved up about that. Going to really start to dive into these teams and see where each one of these teams really sits right now. I looked at my pre-spring power rankings from last year. Oof. Hopefully I can be a little bit more dialed in. Hopefully I can be a little bit better, certainly this season. I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching Big Ten Ted, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.